Hello. You might be able to tell that I'm in the Trinity Sanctuary today, but I'm not in the usual preaching place. I was drawn over to this display area where there's a display for National Indigenous Day, and I see some rocks. Some people like to collect rocks. I do, a little anyway, not as much as my mother, who has been known to fill a suitcase with what can only be described as boulders from around the globe, so she can put them by her pond in the backyard. But I do like the feel of a nice rock in my palm. I like the look and the shape of rocks, and I pick them up often as reminders of places and things and people. Where's this rock come from? What's its story? In that sense, rocks are like people, aren't they? They're shaped by events and the world around. And we don't think of rocks as changing. They're steadfast, they're immovable, they're strong, and yet rocks are shaped all of the time by forces around them. Chipped, cracked, washed, polished, ground by water and sun and wind and snow. Over time, rocks are shaped by their surroundings, as are we. And in chapter 51, the prophet Isaiah proclaims, "Listen to me, all you who are serious about right living and committed to seeking God. Ponder the rock from which you were cut, the quarry from which you were dug." Dr. Ingrid Lilly, who is a Hebrew Bible professor from Western Kentucky University, calls this section of Isaiah a sermon for disorientation, which is maybe why I was drawn to it. We're in a disorienting time, full of so many transitions. All of our old patterns have been upended, uprooted. We've gone through the gamut of emotions: anxiety, remorse, confusion, anger, maybe even excitement if some of the changes are things we have been waiting for. But everything is disrupted, and ancient peoples maybe did not experience the same kinds of changes that we are experiencing, but they were quite familiar with disruption and disorientation. And in Isaiah 51 is a message to bring comfort and hope to a community struggling to recover from a big transition when they were forced to leave their home and go to Babylon in exile. Except that this message of healing isn't like a hug or a warm blanket. Instead, Isaiah asks his people to open their eyes and their ears, to give voice to their experience and learn from it, instead of only experiencing the change, to participate in it and shape it. Well, we know about disorientation from the arrival of COVID and now the releasing of restrictions, even as Beijing is experiencing a new outbreak. New cases are surging in Oklahoma and Arizona and Florida, among others. The death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor shone spotlights on inequities and law enforcement practices, causing demonstrations and riots around the globe, which have raised questions and conversations about other systems and inequalities and systemic patterns. We're still trying to figure out how we can be the church when so many things that were the cornerstones of our life together have come to a halt and are considered behaviors that would put people at risk, even as we try to hold on to and cultivate spiritual health and well-being. And the voice of Isaiah rings out to me, saying, "Listen to me, all you who are serious about right living, committed to seeking God. Ponder the rock from which you were cut, the quarry from which you were dug." Quarry literally means the hole or the pit, the hole of the pit. And the situation of the world may make us wonder if in fact we are in the hole of the pit. But the call from Isaiah is to examine that hole, that pit, not to ignore it and hope it goes away or disappears or pretend it has no effect on us. It occurs to me that so many of us do not recognize the factors that have shaped and formed us over time, given us our own smooth or jagged edges, without us even being aware of it. I've been thinking, for example, about the conversations about systemic racism that are being lifted up in the United States, but also in Canada. And we resist that label. We're not like that, except that we kind of are. Like these stones. We've been formed by a whole lot of things you can't see. Hidden assumptions and biases that have formed our society. I've been learning that you can be an inclusive and loving and welcoming person, seeking to make the world better, and still participate in a racist system. So take me, for example. I have a brother who is Indigenous. He's not gonna love me talking about this. Les, happy Father's Day. He became part of our family just before his 3rd birthday. And the first time that someone suggested to me that our adoption of my brother was a racist act, I was very hurt and angry and offended. And at the time, I disagreed a lot. There was no racist intention. There was no intention to adopt an Indigenous child and make him white. To us, he was just a kid who needed a family. And I think my brother would agree that there was never a racist action toward him in my immediate family. I'm honestly not sure if that's totally true of the extended family or not. I hope so, but I've never asked him. That's just a small example of how I kind of always assumed that my experience was his experience. I let my vision block me from actually learning about his experience or understanding what it was like for him. And I know of some of the racism he experienced in our community growing up, but I always assumed that he didn't get any of that in our family. I hope that's true, but I'm gonna have to ask. And the truth is that my brother's adoption into our family was absolutely part of a wider racist system that placed Indigenous children into white families for their own good, that we now call the 60s scoop, that continued into the 70s and in the 80s. And so as much as I am grateful for his presence in my life and my family, I must also now acknowledge that we benefited from and participated in something that was systemically racist. There's been a lot of talk about systemic racism lately, and I hope right now police officers can hear the difference there, that we all have personal and individual responsibility for how we behave, but even if we don't carry bias and prejudice within us in our hearts or our personal actions, we still might be part of something that we didn't even realize was treating some of us differently than others of us. This past year, I've been part of a group planning worship for a conference that, due to COVID-19, didn't actually happen. And originally, I was one of 2 people asked to coordinate all of the worship for an event. And hoping to be attentive to intercultural realities in ministry, my white colleague and I sought the counsel of several persons of color to help us with the task. And the very first bit of feedback we received was that it wasn't surprising to them that 2 white ordained people were the ones in charge. And then we spent quite a lot of time listening to a variety of experience about how over many years they had been silenced or shut down or dismissed or tokenized or ignored by the white church, which in that context was me. It was not pleasant to be on the receiving end of that. And it was really not easy to figure out how to move forward with the task we'd been given, with the planning process. We were only just beginning to sort out a path forward when we were stopped. But I feel like we learned a lot, and we were starting to make some sort of beginning together. And yet it was so surprising to me to learn that in a church that has spent so much time and energy trying to draw the circle wide and be more inclusive, we still have this environment that tends to treat some of us differently than others. And those of us who aren't treated differently don't even know it. I heard someone on the news say this week that the only people he had heard saying that we're not in a racist system or a racist country are people who are white. I've seen others illustrate this reality through a put a finger down challenge, which helps to illustrate the invisible advantages of being white. Advantages that increase if you also happen to be educated, heterosexual, financially secure, physically able. Senator Murray Sinclair said recently, "Some people believe that systemic racism is when everybody in a system is racist. And there's no system where everybody is racist," he said. "Systemic racism is when the system itself is based upon and founded upon racist beliefs or philosophies and thinking, and has put in place policies and practices that literally force even the non-racists to act in racist ways." So it's what you would call systemic racism. Well, it's hard to know exactly what to do with that when you are within those systems. I hearken back to the prophet Isaiah, who said, "Listen, ponder the rock from which you were cut. Consider the quarry. We're all part of this environment, products of this environment in which we've been formed. Father's Day is a great day to remember that we've inherited much from our fathers, great and not so great, conscious and unconscious. And we can learn from all of it. We're formed by it, but we need not be conformed by it. That's why it's not enough to be not a racist, because we're in a system that counts on us to let it be as it is. We're called to be anti-racist. We need to proclaim that Black lives matter, that brown lives matter, that Indigenous lives matter, because by our culture's behavior, you can't always tell. And sadly, for some people, they really don't matter. Years ago, educated Jane Elliott stood on a stage in front of an audience and said, "I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats our Black citizens, if you'd be happy to receive the treatment that our Black citizens do in this society, please stand." Nobody stood. And she said, "Oh, you didn't understand the directions," and she repeated the question. And then she said, "No one's standing here." That says very plainly that you know what is happening. You know you don't want it for you. And I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or allow it to happen for others. You know, I suspect if I were to be in her audience today, and she asked me if I would be willing to be treated the way Canadian society treats Indigenous people or people of color, to please stand, not sure I would. The world right now needs us all to make room for inconvenience, or disruption, for the health and well-being of those who are most at risk among us. So the goal is not actually a return to normal, but something new, as disorienting and difficult as that continues to be. Even now, I am worried about saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing, because no doubt I will say the wrong things and do the wrong things. And there are always people willing to jump in and criticize. But often those people who are jumping all over you are people who are just afraid. And sometimes they're not willing or they're not able to learn or change or grow. They too are rocks who have been formed by their experience and their environment. But that's part of how Isaiah's words of challenge became comforting to his people. As he said, "Listen, you who know right from wrong, you are holding my teaching inside of you. Pay no attention to the insults. When mocked, don't let it get you down. My setting things right lasts. My salvation goes on and on and on." Isaiah says, look to the rock, look to the quarry, to Abraham and to Sarah. Indeed, as we recall the rocks from which we have been cut, we will start to remember those who have taught us the values that ground us, those who sought justice, those who taught us how to be in difficult systems and finding pathways forward. We will remember how God calls people from the known into the unknown. We will remember how God invites us into a vision of forgiveness so that we can acknowledge and learn from our mistakes. We're not afraid to try and to try again if we have to. Perhaps we will remember how God sustains people in the midst of all of the disorientation. While there is pain in the pit, there are also glimpses of a higher vision, where all people are valued and worthy of love and respect. Isaiah says, in the midst of mounds of ruins, there are reminders of the garden of God, filled with exuberance and laughter, thankful voices, and melodious songs. I'm missing those melodious songs, aren't you? And yet they are part of the rock that I cling to in all of my disorientation. Because if I keep digging, I discover that God is, in fact, the rock from which I was first cut, whose shaping us has the power to transform. That is, finally, the rock that tells us whose we are and who we can be together. May it be so. Amen.